There are moments in royal history that feel like earthquakes. Sudden, violent, impossible to ignore. And when news broke that Harry and Meghan had been quietly, deliberately, and unmistakably banned from attending the Royal Variety performance at London's Royal Albert Hall, while William and Kate were not only invited but positioned as the evening's centerpiece, something shifted. Not just within the family, not just in the media, but in the global understanding of what this feud has become. Because this wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a scheduling conflict. It wasn't unavailability. It was a message. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. A message wrapped in velvet gloves, delivered by palace courtiers who have mastered the art of smiling while wielding knives. A message so sharp, so public, so unmistakable that even the most neutral royal observers had to ask, what exactly happened behind the scenes for the monarchy to lock the doors of one of its most symbolic events to its own prince? And why now? Before we even get into the layers of tension, the secret meetings, the whispered warnings from royal advisors, and the private reactions inside Montecito, let's start with a question for you, the audience. How would you feel if your entire family was attending one of the biggest, most glamorous events of the year, and they made sure the world knew you weren't welcome? Not forgotten, not overlooked, not accidentally left off the list. No, explicitly not invited. For Harry and Meghan, that sting was only the beginning. Because the Royal Variety performance isn't just a show. It's not another dinner. It's not a charity gala lost in the endless rotation of royal obligations. It is a symbol, a legacy, an institution. One of the few events that bridges the monarchy with entertainment, tradition, diplomacy, public admiration, and national identity all at once. Being there is a sign you're still connected. Being absent is a sign you're out. And being banned? That's a declaration. The kind of declaration that draws a bright red line across the royal landscape, separating the past from the future, separating those who remain part of the institution from those who have become complications. And the timing makes it even more explosive. Because just days earlier, Meghan had made comments, private comments, but comments that always find their way to the surface, about how the royal family continued to undermine her achievements. Weeks before that, Harry had spoken in an interview about how he still hoped for reconciliation, even though he claimed the palace wasn't willing to engage. Reconciliation? Not anymore. This move didn't shut a door quietly. It slammed it. Loud enough for the entire world to hear. But let's rewind for a moment, because the real story didn't begin with the ban. It began with a leak. The invitation list for the Royal Variety performance is typically sealed tighter than a state secret. Invitations go out discreetly. Press guidelines are controlled with military precision. Even performers are instructed not to reveal their attendance until the palace gives approval. But this year, something strange happened. A journalist, one known for receiving quiet whispers from palace insiders, announced that William and Kate would be the star royal guests of the evening. The headline was crisp, celebratory, and intentional. And then, almost like an aftershock, social media erupted with a second revelation. Harry and Meghan were not attending. Fair enough, some said. They live in California. Surely that explains it. But then came the bomb. They weren't invited. Those three words hit the public like a spark landing in dry grass. Not invited. Not allowed. Not welcome. And the significance was immediately obvious to those who understand the monarchy's unspoken language. Royal events don't just happen. Every choice is deliberate. Every invitation carries weight. Every omission tells a story. So what story was the palace telling here? To understand that, you need to realize something crucial. The Royal Variety performance isn't chosen randomly. It is one of the few events where attendance is used to signal who is rising within the family and who is falling. Years ago, William and Harry appeared at this same event together, laughing, joking, connecting with performers, embodying the unity the royal family so desperately tried to project. That night, the cameras loved them. The audience adored them. And in a rare moment, the brothers seemed inseparable. But tonight, the stage was different. The players were different. The stakes were different. And the royal family, yes, the same monarchy that insisted Harry and Meghan would always remain much-loved members, made it clear they were drawing a line. But the public didn't know the full story yet. They saw headlines. They saw reactions. They saw speculation. What they didn't see, or at least not yet, was what happened behind closed doors. Because somewhere deep inside the palace, long before that list went public, something had already snapped. Some advisors warned of further reputational risk. Some insisted the presence of the Sussexes would overshadow the event. And others believed the monarchy itself was now in a place where the old rules didn't apply. Harry and Meghan, in their eyes, were unpredictable variables. And the royal variety performance is not an event that tolerates variables. But if the palace thought this would be private, they underestimated how fast a secret can move when the family is fractured. Within hours, the news hit Montecito. Within minutes, the reaction began. Imagine Meghan, someone who has always believed she could outsmart the institution, hearing that the institution has finally outmaneuvered her. Imagine Harry, who has been wrestling with his identity for years, realizing the royal family he once lived for had just told him, in the clearest way possible, stay away. Did he pace the room? Did he raise his voice? Did he feel the familiar burn of humiliation? Did Meghan immediately switch into strategy mode, thinking, who leaked this? Why now? What are they planning next? Because that's the thing about the Sussexes. Every public blow becomes a battlefield. Every setback becomes a strategy session. Every humiliation becomes a headline. But this time, the palace moved first. This time, the palace held the advantage. This time, silence wasn't an oversight. It was a strategy. But what pushed the palace to make such a public move? What tension had reached a breaking point? What private exchange? What warning? What statement? What moment triggered this? To answer that, we need to understand the roots of the decision. The quiet planning. The hushed whispers between senior staff. The classified memo that circulated discreetly. The unexpected meeting held in Buckingham Palace 3 weeks before the event. Something happened in that meeting. Something that made senior advisors push for a hard stance. Something that made at least one high-ranking royal say, we can't risk it. Something that made another say, not this year. Not with everything else happening. And once that decision was made, it rippled outward, touching everything it passed. William and Kate were informed first. Not because they asked, but because protocol demanded it. Their response was measured, controlled, neutral on the surface. But behind the scenes? Well, we'll get there. Other senior royals found out through a briefing. Staff were told to prepare for media fallout. Public relations teams were instructed to stay non-committal. And Harry and Meghan? They didn't get a briefing. They didn't get a memo. They didn't get a phone call. They found out the way everyone else did. Through a leak. Now here's the question you need to consider. Was the leak accidental? Or was it part of the message? Because that's where the story gets interesting. The more you look at the timing, the phrasing, the source, the more it starts to look like the exclusion wasn't just a decision. It was a demonstration. A demonstration of control, of hierarchy, of consequence, of power. And the reaction from the public only intensified that message. Some were stunned. Some were outraged. Some said it was about time. But the overwhelming sentiment was clear. This feud is no longer a private family matter. It is now public royal policy. And yet, this is just the opening act. Because there is something else, something bigger, lurking beneath this decision. A deeper reason. A private conflict. A moment that crossed a line. And when you hear what it is, the entire ban will make perfect sense. But we aren't there yet. Not quite. Because before we uncover the real reason, we need to follow the trail. Step by step. Decision by decision. Emotion by emotion. We need to see how this ban didn't appear out of thin air, but built up like a storm. Every argument. Every interview. Every statement. Every silence. A chain of moments that led to this one. And it all begins with the leak. The leak that wasn't supposed to happen. The leak that forced the palace's hand. The leak that turned a private decision into a global spectacle. The leak should never have happened. That's the first thing insiders whispered when the story erupted across every British front page and half of American social media. That this single breach of protocol was the spark that ignited a firestorm so intense it scorched the royal landscape in a matter of hours. But here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. Someone wanted this leak to happen. Because leaks in the royal world don't behave like accidents. They behave like strategies. They slip out at the exact moment someone in power decides silence is no longer useful. They burst into the public sphere with the precision of a message delivered without fingerprints. And when the list of royal attendees for the royal variety performance appeared in a journalist's inbox, a journalist known for receiving whispers the palace accidentally lets fall, the world finally saw what had been brewing behind closed doors for months. William and Kate, confirmed attendees. Harry and Meghan, not invited, not considered, not included, not even in the shadows. And the palace didn't correct it, didn't clarify, didn't soften the blow, which tells you everything. Let's rewind to the exact moment this leak became a headline. Picture a quiet London newsroom, the kind with the soft hum of computers and the hushed concentration of journalists trying to get ahead of the next story. One reporter opens an email, an anonymous tip, a simple line. Check the Royal Variety guest list. Only the Waleses are attending. That's all it took. Within minutes, the story was being drafted. Within an hour, editors circulated it internally. And then, like a bomb with no warning, the headline went live. William and Kate to attend Royal Variety performance while Harry and Meghan are absent. Absent. That was the word chosen. Neutral enough to avoid accusations. Sharp enough to raise eyebrows. But social media isn't neutral. The public isn't neutral. The world isn't neutral. The moment people saw who was attending and who wasn't, the speculation began. Then, the real shock hit. Insiders confirmed Harry and Meghan weren't just absent. They had been purposely left off the invitation list. That's when the internet exploded. And somewhere in Montecito, you can imagine Harry staring at his phone, scrolling through article after article, his jaw tightening, his heart pounding, not because he couldn't attend, but because no one had bothered to tell him. Even ex-royals expect basic courtesy. But courtesy is the first thing to disappear when a family turns into a battlefield. Now let's take a moment and ask the obvious question. How did Harry and Meghan find out before the palace even briefed them? Because leaks travel faster than protocol. Think about that. In a world where every detail is controlled, filtered, polished, and choreographed, the one thing that broke the silence was not a royal aide, not an official letter, not a discreet phone call. It was the public. The world told Harry before his own family did. If that doesn't sting, what does? Imagine being Harry. Once the Golden Prince, the soldier adored by the public, the brother inseparable from William, now learning from strangers online that the monarchy had crossed his name off the list for one of the biggest royal nights of the year. Not invited, not welcomed, not wanted. So the leak wasn't just news. It was humiliation. And humiliation is a powerful accelerant. Let's break down why this moment cut deeper than other slights, interviews, or controversies. Most royal events are private. Most tensions stay silent. Most decisions are sanitized before reaching the public. But this was different. The Royal Variety performance is a global stage, a historical milestone, a symbol of legacy and continuity, a place where royals have smiled, waved, shaken hands, and represented the crown for over a century. Attendance communicates status. Absence communicates distance. Exclusion communicates conflict. So when Harry and Meghan were excluded, and when the leak confirmed it, it didn't just expose a rift. It exposed a rupture. But here's where things get even more intriguing. The palace could have denied it. They could have said the Sussexes were busy. They could have said it wasn't their year. They could have claimed scheduling issues. But they didn't. Silence was the statement. Silence said, yes, they're not coming. Silence said, yes, this was intentional. Silence said, yes, the divide is deeper than you think. This brings us to a crucial but overlooked detail. The leak didn't include the full list right away. Only one key pair was named. Only one gap was highlighted. That's odd, isn't it? If someone wanted the entire list out, they would have leaked the entire list. But the leak was focused, sharp, precise. It pointed directly to the absence of Harry and Meghan. That's what makes insiders whisper that this leak wasn't clumsy, it was targeted. Someone wanted the world to notice the missing names. Someone wanted to send a signal. Someone wanted this moment to land exactly how it did, like a public reckoning. But who? A senior royal aide? A palace department? An outside source acting with inside approval? We may never know the exact hand behind the curtain, but the effect was unmistakable. Now, let's shift the scene from London to Montecito, because the moment this reached California, everything changed. You can picture Meghan receiving the news with a mixture of disbelief and cold fury. Meghan is many things, but indifferent is not one of them. She has always been strategic, meticulous, and attentive to optics. So imagine her seeing headlines that screamed exclusion. Did she immediately suspect sabotage? Did she call her closest advisors? Did she pace with intensity, replaying every recent comment she made that could have provoked the palace? Did she ask Harry, "Why didn't they tell you?" Because that question, "Why didn't they tell you?" is the one that burns. Ordinary families can be petty, but royal families? Their pettiness comes wrapped in centuries of protocol. Harry, meanwhile, would have taken it differently, more personally, more emotionally, because beneath his public persona, Harry's greatest wound has always been identity. Who he is, where he belongs, which family he fits into. And this moment, this ban, this exclusion, this silence, would have hit exactly where it hurts most. He may have tried to act calm. He may have said he expected it. He may have shrugged it off. But inside, he would have felt the sting of rejection that reaches back through years of strained phone calls, missed birthdays, awkward video meetings, and unresolved betrayal. What makes this leak even more interesting is what happened next. The media swarmed. Commentators speculated. Reporters called royal aides. And for hours, the palace said nothing. No denial. No correction. No attempt to soften the story. Which, in palace terms, is the equivalent of saying, "Let them talk. Let the world know. We stand by the decision." But there is another layer here. A deeper one. Because the event itself, the royal variety performance, is not just another night on the calendar. It's the kind of gathering where every royal gesture sends a message. The palace knew that inviting William and Kate would amplify their status. They knew excluding Harry and Meghan would expose the divide. They knew the leak would become a headline. And still, they let it happen. Which begs the question, what did the palace think Harry and Meghan might do if they were invited? Because royal planners don't make decisions based on sentiment. They make decisions based on risk. And Harry and Meghan, whether fairly or unfairly, are now considered a risk. A risk of overshadowing. A risk of tension. A risk of headlines. A risk of unpredictable reactions. A risk of becoming the story instead of supporting it. And the royal variety performance was not a night the palace was willing to gamble with. But this chapter isn't just about the leak. It's about what the leak exposed. It exposed the palace's readiness to separate themselves publicly from the Sussexes. It exposed the growing closeness between William, Kate, and the institution. It exposed how fragile the family dynamic has become. It exposed the palace's willingness to use public events as private statements. It exposed, in the biggest way yet, that the monarchy no longer sees Harry and Meghan as part of the working royal ecosystem. Let's go deeper into the timeline, because this is where details become telling. The leak happened at 9:47 a.m. London time. By 10:03 a.m., social media was trending with the names Meghan, Harry, and royal variety. By 10:12 a.m., the first journalist asked Kensington Palace for comment. By 11 a.m., 3 major broadcasters had requested official statements. By noon, the story was global. During all that chaos, the palace could have shut it down. They didn't. Instead, at 1:15 p.m., a short, cryptic statement from a royal spokesperson arrived. The Prince and Princess of Wales are delighted to attend the royal variety performance. No mention of the Sussexes. No clarification. No explanation. Silence, again, speaking louder than any sentence. But here's the most shocking part. The leak wasn't the first sign. It was the final sign. Because sources close to the family later revealed that the decision to exclude Harry and Meghan was made weeks earlier, in a private meeting at Buckingham Palace. And that decision? It wasn't unanimous. It wasn't simple. It wasn't without conflict. Someone argued strongly for the ban. Someone argued against it. Someone warned that the optics would be explosive. Someone else said the optics needed to be explosive. But the end result was the same. Harry and Meghan were cut off the list, leaving us with one burning question. Who pushed for it? Because the leak didn't come from nowhere. It came from someone close enough to know the truth. Someone with something to gain. Someone who wanted the world to see the fracture. And that's the real mystery behind Chapter 1. Not just that Harry and Meghan were excluded, but that someone wanted the world to witness it. Someone wanted the consequences. Someone wanted the reaction. Someone wanted the message to be unmistakable. But who exactly made the final decision? And why was it made when it was? That answer lies inside a private room in Buckingham Palace. A room where senior staff gathered, tension thick enough to cut. Most people think the royal variety performance is just a glamorous night out. A red carpet, sparkling gowns, music, comedy, and dancing beneath the gilded arches of the Royal Albert Hall. But here's the truth that only insiders know. This event has more political weight than half the royal calendar combined. It is the monarchy's unofficial annual report card, its chance to show the world who stands tall, who is rising, and who is quietly being moved off stage. So when Harry and Meghan were excluded, this wasn't just a snub. It was a statement, a declaration of hierarchy, a symbolic rewriting of the royal pecking order. But to understand why this exclusion hit like a lightning bolt, you need to understand why this event, of all events, matters so deeply. Let's open with the real question. Why does one night of entertainment hold such enormous meaning? To answer that, we need to go back, way back, to the roots of the royal variety performance. It started as a way for the monarchy to show gratitude to performers who uplifted the nation through wars, depressions, and crises. Over time, it evolved into a public demonstration of royal stability. When a senior royal sits in that royal box, they're not just enjoying the show. They're signaling continuity, unity, leadership, and invitations aren't distributed lightly. There's no last-minute scrambling, no guesswork, no randomness. It's a chessboard. Every seat is part of a larger strategy. Every royal appearance communicates something, even if the public doesn't immediately see the nuance. And the royal variety is one of the clearest indicators of who the monarchy wants to present as its trusted representatives for the next year. So let's break this down. Last year, King Charles attended despite rumors of exhaustion. The year before, William and Kate were the star couple. Years before that, Harry and Meghan stood beside the royal family, smiling and waving, representing unity. But this year, the monarchy wanted the message to be unmistakable. The future of the royal family is William and Kate. Not Harry, not Meghan, not the couple who stepped back, not the couple who went rogue, not the couple who spoke publicly when the palace wanted silence. It was a recentering of power. But why now? Why this year? Why this event? Because after years of interviews, memoirs, documentaries, and explosive accusations, the royal family is done playing defense. Instead of reacting to Harry and Meghan, they're taking proactive steps to define who represents the monarchy and who doesn't. And nothing communicates that faster than a controlled, carefully crafted public event. Think about the symbolism. William and Kate walk into the Royal Albert Hall greeted by thunderous applause. Hundreds of cameras flash. Performers bow. Commentators praise their elegance and poise. The global narrative is written instantly. Here are the future king and queen. Here are the royals who stayed loyal. Here are the steady hands guiding the monarchy. Now imagine if Harry and Meghan were also there. The tension, the headlines, the comparisons, the speculation, the optics. Would photographers focus on the Waleses or the Sussexes? Would the press discuss royal diplomacy or royal drama? Would the world see unity or two royal couples locked in a silent feud? And here's the uncomfortable truth. The palace knows that Harry and Meghan draw attention like magnets. Not always positive attention, but attention nonetheless. And on this night, this one night of tradition, glamour, and national pride, the palace didn't want attention divided. They wanted a clean page, a clean picture, a clean message. And Harry and Meghan's presence would have contaminated the picture, not because of who they are, but because of what they bring with them. Controversy, emotion, unanswered questions. Cold, unfinished business. The monarchy wanted none of it. Now, here's the twist. Before all this drama, before the ban, before the leak, there were quiet whispers that Harry and Meghan might have considered attending if invited. Not publicly, not loudly, but quietly, perhaps hoping for a sign of reconciliation, perhaps craving even a symbolic gesture that said, "Despite everything, you are still part of us." But no such gesture came. Instead, the palace made a decision rooted in history, strategy, and fear. Yes, fear. Fear of overshadowing. Fear of unpredictable reactions. Fear of unplanned drama. Fear of distraction from the monarchy's public priorities. fear that Harry and Meghan would bring Montecito headlines into the royal auditorium. And if you think that sounds cold, ask yourself, would you invite two people who have publicly criticized your family to represent your family? Would you take that risk? Would you want them seated in front of a global audience? Would you chance an uncomfortable encounter on camera, broadcast worldwide? The palace's answer was clear, and that clarity turned into exclusion. Exclusion leaked into headlines. Headlines turned into humiliation. Humiliation turned into speculation. But to fully grasp why this stung so deeply for the Sussexes, you need to understand the role the royal variety performance played during their time as working royals. Because there was a moment, just a few years ago, when Harry and Meghan attended this event as one of the monarchy's most dazzling assets. They walked the red carpet. Meghan's gown made headlines. Harry shook hands with performers. The couple stood side by side as symbols of modernity and hope within the royal institution. That night, the press praised them as the future. They were adored. They were powerful. They were embraced. Now, contrast that with the present moment. From celebrated guests to uninvited outsiders, from dynamic representatives to potential risks, from symbols of unity to symbols of division. It's not just a fall, it's a reversal, and reversals hurt. But the performance itself, the event's location, adds another layer. Because the Royal Albert Hall is more than a venue. It is a royal jewel, a cultural temple, a space where tradition meets performance with seamless elegance. When royals step into that hall, they aren't just attending a show. They're renewing their connection to the nation. They're participating in a ritual. They're symbolizing solidarity with the arts. Removing Harry and Meghan from that moment, that wasn't arbitrary. That wasn't petty. It was strategic. And here's the kicker. Multiple sources later confirmed that the planning committee asked a direct question during internal discussions. Would inviting the Sussexes cause more harm than good? The answer was yes. And that sealed their fate. But the deeper you go into this event's importance, the more symbolic this ban becomes. Because historically, the royal variety performance has hosted some of the most iconic royal appearances ever recorded. Queen Elizabeth II attended for decades. Princess Diana dazzled audiences during her visits. Even young Prince George made headlines when he asked William if he could go to the show where the dancers do the funny dances. This event is woven into royal identity. It is part of their cultural DNA. An exclusion from it is not something that happens lightly. But maybe the most surprising fact is this. In over 100 years of this event's existence, no royal couple has ever been publicly sidelined the way Harry and Meghan were this year. Never. Not once. Not even during scandals. Not even during tensions. Not even during divorces, crises, or public upheavals. Which means this ban wasn't normal. It was unprecedented. And unprecedented moves don't happen without unprecedented reasons. So the real question becomes, what exactly happened behind the scenes to justify this? Was it Meghan's recent comments? Was it Harry's memoir still leaving bruises? Was it internal pressure from advisors? Was it an issue of trust? Or was it something deeper, something not yet revealed to the public? Because insiders claim the decision wasn't based on one moment, but on a pattern. A pattern that convinced senior royals that the Sussexes attending would not help the monarchy's stability. Think about that. For an institution built on image, perception, and the illusion of unity, having two members who often operate independently, unpredictably, and emotionally is risky. And on the biggest entertainment night of the year, the palace wanted calm, predictability, camera-friendly smiles, controlled interactions, not tension, not forced proximity, not accidental confrontations, not awkward glances that tabloids would dissect for months. So the palace chose the safest path, the clearest path, the path that laid the foundation for the monarchy's messaging. There is one future king. There is one future queen. They sit in the royal box. Not Harry, not Meghan. But remember, the public didn't know all of this. They only saw the headlines. They only saw the leak. They only saw the exclusion. What they didn't know yet, what we haven't uncovered yet, is the confession from a senior royal aide that changed everything. Because there was a reason behind the ban that went deeper than public drama, deeper than media narratives, deeper than family tension. A reason that will reveal why the monarchy made this decision not with uncertainty, but with conviction. And once that reason comes to light, the entire story shifts. Because the exclusion wasn't just intentional. It was necessary. But what exactly did that senior aide confess behind closed doors? And how did that confession push the palace to take a step that reshaped the royal landscape? There are moments when the truth doesn't whisper. It detonates. And according to one palace aide, someone who has survived 3 royal administrations, countless crises, and more internal storms than the public will ever know, Meghan said something that crossed a line so deeply, so shockingly, that the royal variety ban was not only considered reasonable, but absolutely necessary. Let's start with the moment that confession emerged. Picture a dimly lit back office in Buckingham Palace. A cluttered table, coffee cups that have gone cold, papers strewn everywhere, briefings, schedules, press summaries, risk assessments. Tensions so thick they feel almost material. And sitting across from one another, senior staff members debate the biggest royal decision of the season, whether Harry and Meghan should be allowed to attend one of the monarchy's most symbolic annual events. Some staff believe excluding them is dangerous. Some believe including them is even more dangerous. Some think reconciliation is still possible. Some think the bridge has burned forever. And then, one advisor speaks. Not loudly, not aggressively, just calmly enough to silence the room. There is something you all need to know, they say. You can imagine the others leaning forward. Because when someone who rarely speaks decides to open their mouth during a crisis, you listen. And this advisor reveals an alleged private comment from Meghan, a comment that, until that moment, had been kept contained within a narrow circle. A comment shared in confidence with someone she believed she could trust. Except that trust had cracked. Now here's the moment you feel the temperature in the room drop. Because Meghan's alleged words weren't just emotional. They weren't just frustrated. They weren't just critical. They were explosive. But before we reveal exactly what she reportedly said, you need to understand the context of the moment. You need to visualize the situation leading up to this alleged comment. Because words like these don't appear in a vacuum. They come from pressure, irritation, wounded pride, and relentless public friction. It happened, according to insiders, during a private conversation months before the royal variety guest list was finalized. A moment when Meghan felt sidelined by the palace yet again. An event she believed she should have been a part of, but wasn't. A moment when frustrations boiled over. You can imagine the scene, Meghan pacing. Voice sharp, tone clipped. Harry nearby, perhaps trying to calm things. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he was silent. Maybe he was used to these spirals. Maybe he didn't expect what would come next. And then Meghan said it. The words that would echo all the way to that Buckingham Palace meeting. They only care about William and Kate. The rest of us are just props they can throw out when we're no longer useful. Not a gentle remark. Not a neutral observation. Not even a diplomatic critique. A direct accusation that sliced straight into the heart of the monarchy. That the royal institution uses people, discards them, and prioritizes William and Kate at the expense of everyone else, including Harry. And keep in mind, this wasn't said in an interview. Not in a book. Not in a podcast. This was allegedly said privately, unguarded, raw, and without the polish of a planned narrative. But the advisor didn't stop there. Apparently, Meghan continued. More frustrated, more heated, and she said something else, something even sharper. One day they'll regret pushing us aside, because we know things they don't want the world to hear. That sentence, that one line, sent shockwaves through the room when the advisor revealed it. Why? Because it wasn't just criticism. It was leverage. It was a warning, a veiled threat, not overt, not formal, not written, but a threat nonetheless. And if there is one thing the monarchy does not tolerate, it is the suggestion that private royal information could be weaponized. At that moment in the meeting, the atmosphere changed. Arguments stopped. Debates froze. People exchanged glances that said everything words couldn't. Because whether Meghan truly meant it or not, whether she was venting or calculating, whether she was emotional or strategic, the implication was clear. She believed she held power, and she insinuated she could use it. This one revelation reframed the entire conversation. The palace was no longer deciding whether to invite Harry and Meghan. They were deciding whether to expose themselves to the possibility of an unpredictable couple entering a public arena with unresolved grievances and implied threats. Think about that. Would any institution, much less one rooted in centuries of tradition, secrecy, and controlled optics. Take that risk? Would any royal advisor dare say, "Yes, let's seat them in the royal box," after hearing such a comment? Now let's pause. Let's breathe. Let's address something important. This is alleged. Not publicly confirmed. Not on record. Not stamped with royal signatures. But in the world of palace operations, whispers often matter more than documents. Feelings matter more than facts. Perception matters more than proof. And those alleged words, true, exaggerated, or misinterpreted, were enough to change the internal conversation permanently. But here's the real twist. The advisor who shared this information wasn't trying to sabotage Harry and Meghan. Quite the opposite. They reportedly admired Harry. They felt sympathy for Meghan at times. They believed the royal family had made mistakes. They believed reconciliation was possible. Until that moment. Because in the royal world, implying you might expose secrets is a line you don't cross. Not if you want to remain within the circle. Not if you want invitations. Not if you want inclusion or respect. Let's stop and ask the viewer. If someone you once trusted suggested, even indirectly, that they could damage your family, would you invite them to the most public event of the season? Would you risk a confrontation? Would you risk a micro-expression caught on camera? Would you risk them standing inches from the future king and queen? Would you risk them overshadowing the narrative? Or would you quietly remove them from the equation? You and I both know the answer. The monarchy did what any powerful institution would do. It protected itself. But the conversation didn't end with the alleged remark. Because when the advisor finished recounting Meghan's words, they added something else, something that instantly shifted the emotional atmosphere of the room. It wasn't just what she said, they explained. It was how she said it. Apparently Meghan wasn't resigned. She wasn't weeping or defeated. She was energized, passionate, fiery, determined. And determination, mixed with resentment, scares institutions that depend on control. Harry, reportedly, was quieter in the moment. Conflicted, frustrated. Some say he looked torn, like he understood why Meghan felt the way she did, but also recognized the dangerous implications of the words. Harry has always inhabited the space between two worlds. The monarchy shaped him. Meghan liberated him. But both worlds come with consequences. Still, what Meghan allegedly said wasn't the only issue. The advisor revealed a second moment. Another private comment Meghan made shortly afterward, this time about her long-term view of the royal feud. And this one made the room freeze entirely. "I won't let them paint us as the villains," she reportedly said. "If they push us away, then we'll tell our story our way." Now think about that from the palace's perspective. The Sussexes have already told their story repeatedly. The Oprah interview, the Netflix docuseries, Harry's memoir, magazine interviews, public appearances, podcast episodes. What exactly would our way mean now? What more could be said? What more could be revealed? What line had not yet been crossed? That uncertainty is what terrified the institution. It wasn't the comment itself. It was the open-ended threat of escalation. And escalation, in the royal world, is a ticking bomb. Let's bring this back to the royal variety performance. If you were the monarchy, why would you invite someone who has openly and repeatedly challenged your authority? Why would you include someone who believes you undervalue them? Why would you risk triggering a confrontation on camera? Why would you put someone in the royal box who allegedly believes the monarchy uses people? You wouldn't. You couldn't. Not if you want to control the narrative. Not if you want to send a message about stability. Not if you want to protect the future heirs. Not if you want to avoid catastrophe. This alleged comment was the tipping point. Not the only reason. Not the earliest reason. But the most decisive one. The moment the advisor spoke those words, the room changed. The energy shifted. Every senior staffer in that meeting felt the gravity. The debate was over. The decision was made. Harry and Meghan were out. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. This revelation didn't just expose tension. It exposed something the public didn't realize. The palace wasn't afraid of Meghan's influence. They were afraid of her voice. They weren't afraid she would show up and smile. They were afraid she would show up and speak. They weren't afraid of her presence. They were afraid of her power. And that fear changed everything. But what makes this chapter even more explosive is the detail people often overlook. This alleged comment didn't stay between advisors. It eventually made its way to someone else. Someone higher. Someone with real authority. someone whose opinion carries more weight than any aide, advisor, or strategist. And when that person heard it, the royal variety decision became irreversible. So the real question becomes, who heard the comment? Who weighed it? Who interpreted it as a threat? Who decided the Sussexes were no longer safe guests for high-profile royal events? And why did they believe this was the moment to make a stand? Because the answer to that question doesn't just reveal why Meghan and Harry were banned. It reveals who within the palace is quietly pulling the strings. It takes only one room, one quiet, polished, deceptively calm room inside Buckingham Palace, to change the fate of an entire royal branch. And for Harry and Meghan, that moment came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, a day that should have blended into the usual blur of palace operations, paperwork, planning meetings, and ceremonial rehearsals. But this time, something different was happening behind those tall white doors. A secret meeting had been called, not a scheduled briefing, not a routine planning session, not a casual update on upcoming engagements. This was a closed-door gathering of senior staff, handpicked, high stakes, no notes allowed, no digital devices, no chance of leaks. At least, that was the intention. But as we now know, something did leak. And it all started in this room. Let's set the scene. The meeting took place in a space that only insiders truly understand. A room where the palace makes decisions about the monarchy's public image, its strategy, its survival. The walls lined with portraits of monarchs long gone. A heavy mahogany table dominating the center. A fireplace that crackled softly despite it being only early autumn. Curtains drawn just enough to dim the room, but still let in streaks of gray London light. 6 people were there. Only 6. The most trusted strategists, private secretaries, and senior advisors. They weren't invited randomly. These were the individuals who knew how to shape public perception with a single sentence. The ones who drafted speeches, rewrote crisis responses, and handled everything from scandals to state visits. The ones who have lived through controversies you and I will never hear about. And on that day, they assembled for one reason: to finalize the Royal Variety Performance guest list. Except that wasn't really the reason. The guest list itself was never the issue. The issue was the dilemma the palace had been avoiding for months. Should Harry and Meghan be invited? It sounds simple. It sounds procedural. It sounds like a box that needs checking. But inside the palace, that question had turned into a minefield. Because inviting them might signal reconciliation, but excluding them would signal rupture. Either way, the world would look. The press would pounce. The story would spin. The palace's intentions would be dissected to the bone. And this meeting, the one so secret it wasn't written on any schedule, was where the decision had to be made. Let's rewind to the instant the meeting began. The senior private secretary cleared his throat. He didn't waste time with niceties. "We need to address the Sussex issue," he said, his voice low, steady, and unmistakably serious. And just like that, the room's temperature dropped. The Sussex issue. Not Harry. Not Meghan. Not the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Not the couple. The Sussex issue. A problem. A complication. A risk. And in that single phrase, you can feel everything the palace had been feeling for years finally rising to the surface. Someone else spoke next. An older advisor. One who had served the Queen. One who believed deeply, sometimes too deeply, in tradition. "If they attend," she said, "we are inviting headlines." But another advisor countered quickly. "And if we exclude them, we are also inviting headlines." This was the tension, the impossible tension. At the center of everything. Invite them, and the world would ask why. Exclude them, and the world would ask why harder. One advisor argued for neutrality, another for symbolism, another for long-term strategy, another for immediate optics. Then came the moment when the room fell silent. Because someone, the same advisor from Chapter 3, leaned forward and said, "Before we debate this further, there is something the group needs to be aware of." The room paused, eyes narrowed, fingers interlaced, breaths held, and the advisor revealed Meghan's alleged comment, the one that had never left their mind, the comment that had burned into their memory like a warning, the comment that implied a deep resentment and a willingness to tell their story if pushed further. The room reacted instantly. No one gasped. No one shouted. But the silence was deafening. Because silence, in the palace, is how fear shows itself. The senior private secretary folded his hands. He listened. He processed. And then he asked the most important question of the meeting. Was this said in anger or in intention? The advisor hesitated only briefly before answering. It was said with certainty. Certainty. That one word struck deeper than the alleged comment itself. Not anger. Not frustration. Not emotion. Certainty. Which means Meghan wasn't simply venting. She was making a statement. A declaration. A line in the sand. Another advisor spoke next. This one a communication strategist who had handled multiple crises involving the Sussexes. If she believes she has leverage, they said, then inviting them places us in a vulnerable position. But the most explosive moment of the meeting hadn't arrived yet, because the senior private secretary then opened a folder, thin, crisp, sealed. A folder marked eyes only. Inside that folder was something almost no one outside the palace knew existed. It was a copy of a handwritten note. Short, underlined, dated 3 months before the meeting, written by a senior royal, someone whose authority outranks every advisor in the room. And the note, in part, said this: it may be prudent to consider limiting appearances with the Sussexes for the foreseeable future. Too many recent public statements have placed the institution under unnecessary strain. Read that again. Limiting appearances for the foreseeable future because of strain. That note wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive, polite in tone, deadly in implication, and sudden clarity washed across the room. This wasn't simply about the royal variety performance. This was about a long-term strategy, one that had already begun. From that moment on, everything shifted. The advisors stopped debating whether to invite the Sussexes. They began discussing how to justify not inviting them. One advisor suggested framing it as scheduling conflicts. Another hinted that logistical limitations could be used. Another thought the palace could simply avoid addressing it altogether. But the senior private secretary raised a hand, silencing everyone. We don't need cover, he said. We need consistency. And in palace language, consistency means alignment with the will of the senior royal who wrote that note. Meaning, the decision had already been made. They were simply formalizing it. But this is where things get even more interesting. Because just when the meeting seemed to be reaching its conclusion, someone entered the room, a junior aide, breathless, apologizing for the interruption. They handed the senior private secretary an envelope. Confidential. He opened it. Read it. Frowned. What is it? Someone asked. He placed the paper on the table. It was a report. A short one. Sent from a team responsible for monitoring press chatter, social media sentiment, and online influence surrounding the Sussexes. And the report highlighted something alarming. Meghan's comments, her frustration, her criticism, her veiled warnings, were becoming more frequent. There was mounting evidence that the Sussexes were preparing for another round of public narrative shaping. Something big, something timed, something strategic. The report even suggested Meghan's tone had shifted recently, from defensive to assertive, from reacting to directing. And this made the decision even clearer. One advisor summarized it perfectly. If we include them, we're rewarding volatility. That sealed it. The royal variety performance would proceed without the Sussexes. And because this meeting was so secret, so restricted, so carefully guarded, only a handful of people knew the truth. Most of the palace staff simply received a directive later that day. Harry and Meghan will not be attending. No explanation attached. No justification needed. No questions allowed. But the meeting didn't end where you might think. Because after the decision was made, after the papers were gathered, after the tension relaxed just enough for people to breathe, the senior private secretary said something that froze the room one final time. We still need to brief the future Prince of Wales, he said. This was the moment no one wanted to speak about. Because briefing William wasn't just protocol. It wasn't just tradition. It wasn't just courtesy. It was necessity. William needed to know because William was the face of the monarchy's future. And removing Harry and Meghan from the equation would affect him more than anyone else. He would be the one answering questions. He would be the one facing the cameras. He would be the one dealing with the backlash. He would be the one interpreted by the world as approving the exclusion, even if he hadn't organized it. So as the meeting ended, advisors prepared to speak with him. But before they left, the senior private secretary closed his folder and said quietly, "Be careful with how you explain this. He will not take it lightly. And with that, the meeting adjourned. The decision was final. The strategy was set. The event would proceed without the Sussexes. But the story wasn't finished. Because William, calm, poised, diplomatic William, was about to hear about the ban. And his reaction would shock even the advisors preparing to brief him. No one expected William to react the way he did. Not the advisors who had rehearsed their talking points before approaching him. Not the senior private secretary who had prepared a sanitized explanation. Not the communications director who believed William would remain calm and professionally indifferent. Because William, at least publicly, is unshakable, measured, controlled, hardly ever caught off guard. But behind the scenes, behind the polished exterior, behind the carefully curated smiles and speeches, he is still a brother, still a son, still a man wrestling with wounds the world does not get to see. And when he learned that Harry and Meghan had been officially banned from attending the royal variety performance, something in him snapped. Let's go back to the moment the advisors entered his office. William's workspace isn't ostentatious. It's functional, clean, organized. A desk with neatly stacked folders. A small table with briefing notes. Photos of his children positioned deliberately, not as decorations, but as reminders of responsibility. Outside the window, the gray London sky loomed, hanging low over Kensington Palace. William was reviewing documents for an upcoming engagement when the knock came. "Sir," the private secretary said, "we need a moment of your time. It's regarding the guest list for the royal variety performance." William looked up. And that's when the energy shifted. You know that feeling when someone enters a room and you instantly sense something is wrong? That's the moment William experienced. He didn't know what the problem was, but he felt the weight of it. He straightened in his chair, closed his folder, locked his eyes on the team standing before him. And in a steady, even voice, he said, "Go on." The senior private secretary began with diplomacy. "After careful consideration and following internal discussion, it has been decided that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex will not be included in the royal variety guest list this year." A beat of silence. Not dramatic, not loud, just heavy. William blinked. Not slowly, not thoughtfully, more like a reflexive stutter of disbelief. "They're not invited?" he asked. "No, sir." Another beat. "Was this my father's decision?" William asked. "No, sir," the advisor replied carefully. "The decision was made collectively, after reviewing recent circumstances and internal concerns." William's jaw tightened, just slightly, but enough for every advisor in the room to notice. "Recent circumstances," he repeated. "Internal concerns." His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't mocking. It was something worse. It was controlled frustration. The advisors exchanged quick, uneasy glances. This wasn't how they thought the briefing would go. William leaned back in his chair, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the air between him and the advisors as he processed the information. Then he said something none of them expected. "I don't want this to look like we're punishing Harry." That sentence, quiet, raw, personal, caught the room off guard. Because the palace's internal narrative assumed William had emotionally distanced himself, that he was done trying, that the feud had turned into something cold and irreversible. But hearing those words, you suddenly understand the truth. William may have accepted the separation. He may have accepted the consequences. He may have accepted the chaos Harry created, but he had not accepted the idea of humiliating him. And that is why this moment mattered. The advisors hesitated, struggling to respond. The senior private secretary finally said, "Sir, this is not about punishment. It's about stability, predictability, optics." William's eyes sharpened. "Everything we do is optics," he said. "That doesn't mean the world won't see this as a deliberate blow." Another advisor stepped forward. "Sir, the concern isn't public perception. It's internal risk." William inhaled sharply through his nose. Not annoyance, not anger, a moment of clarity. "What risk?" he asked. This was the moment the advisors had been dreading, because now they had to explain the real reason. The reason that had been whispered behind closed doors. The reason that Meghan's alleged comments had set into motion. The advisor who had shared the comment in the secret meeting glanced toward the others. Their eyes urged them to remain silent. But William was waiting, and he wasn't going to accept vague explanations. So the advisor swallowed, stepped forward, and said, "Sir, there have been remarks." remarks suggesting that the Duchess may feel she holds certain information, and that she may feel inclined to use it should the situation escalate. William's expression changed instantly. His posture stiffened. His jaw clenched. The muscles near his temples tightened. "Are you saying she made a threat?" he asked, his voice low. "Not explicitly," the advisor replied, "but enough for us to consider the potential implications." William pressed his fingers against his forehead, exhaling slowly. This was not the briefing he expected, not the direction he wanted, not the narrative he believed should define the monarchy. And here's where the contradiction becomes painful. William wants stability, but he also carries unresolved grief. He wants unity, but he also carries betrayal. He wants peace, but he also carries wounds left by the interviews, the documentary, the book, the criticisms, the accusations. He is torn between duty and brotherhood, between protecting the monarchy and remembering the boy he grew up with, between his responsibility to the crown and his roots as a son of Diana, who hated family division. That tension was written across his face in that moment. Finally, William lowered his hand and looked directly at the advisor who mentioned the alleged comment. "What exactly did she say?" The advisor hesitated. This was the moment everything fractured, because repeating Meghan's alleged statements to William felt like handing him a lit match inside a room soaked in gasoline. But William demanded it. And in the palace, when the future king demands clarity, you give it. So the advisor repeated Meghan's alleged words. "They only care about William and Kate. The rest of us are just props they can throw out when we're no longer useful." Silence. William didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't even breathe noticeably. It was as if the room had frozen around him. And then came the second sentence, the one that hinted at leverage, at danger, at potential fallout. "One day they'll regret pushing us aside, because we know things they don't want the world to hear." William's reaction was subtle but seismic. His hand curled into a fist, so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Not in anger at Meghan, not in rage at the comment, but in something deeper. Fear. Not fear of Meghan, not fear of secrets, not fear of exposure. Fear that Harry had allowed something to fracture so deeply it might now be impossible to repair. Still, William didn't want to feed the advisor's narrative. With a heavy breath, he asked the question he already feared the answer to. "Did Harry say anything?" "No," the advisor replied. He appeared uncomfortable, but he didn't contradict her. And that was the moment William's expression shattered. Because for him, the issue was never Meghan's remarks. It was Harry's silence. Silence, in families, is dangerous. Silence implies agreement. Silence implies resignation. Silence implies surrender. William stood from his chair then, unable to stay seated. He paced, slowly, thoughtfully. Each step carried the weight of years, memories of growing up together, of walking behind their mother's coffin, of shouldering burdens only they understood. And then he turned to the advisors and said something none of them expected. "I'm tired of being the one who looks like the enemy." That was the truth. Raw, unfiltered, human. Because William had become the symbol of the institution, and Harry had become the symbol of rebellion. And between symbolism and reality, the brotherhood was getting crushed. The advisors didn't know how to respond. William continued, voice cracking just slightly, not from weakness, but from emotional exhaustion. "I don't want it to be said that we locked them out, that we shut the door, that we made it impossible for them to come back. Sir," one advisor said gently, "the door is still open. But reconciliation cannot come at the expense of the monarchy's stability." That sentence changed everything, because William finally understood that this wasn't about brotherhood anymore. It wasn't about hurt feelings. It wasn't about family tension. It was about survival. Not Harry's survival. Not Meghan's survival. The monarchy's survival. And William, future king, future symbol of continuity, future defender of tradition, had to choose stability over sentiment. He pressed his palms into the desk, grounding himself. Then, softly but firmly, he said, "If this is the decision, I won't oppose it." But he wasn't done. He added one more sentence, one that stunned the advisors more than anything they had heard that day. "But don't think for a moment that I'm happy about it." And in that moment, the advisors realized something profound. William wasn't ruthless. He wasn't cold. He wasn't vindictive. He was heartbroken. Because even as he agreed to the decision, He knew what it meant. Another cut, another fracture, another mile between him and Harry. Then William sat back down, exhaled slowly, and gave his final instruction. If this is the course we're taking, handle it quietly. No spin, no leaks, no triumph. A noble request, a principled request.